Good Shabbos. This week's portion, Parshas Bo, besides having in it the remainder of the plagues and the discussion and the commandment regarding the offering of the Pesach offering, the Paschal Lamb, there's also the mitzvah of wearing tefillin, and it's mentioned twice in this week's portion. And in total, throughout the Torah, there's 4 different sections which refer to the tefillin. 2 of them are in the Shema. The first paragraph talking about loving God with all your heart, might, and soul. And then it says at the end of that, you shall tie it as a sign on your hand, and a totofot, which could mean many different things, but we'll just use that word for right now, between your eyes. And then it says it again in the second section of the Shema. Both of these are found in Devarim and Deuteronomy. And the second one also talks about loving God, but it also talks about keeping the mitzvot, keeping the commandments. And then it says you should tie it again as a sign on your hand and a totofot between your eyes. In this week's portion, it says it in regard to the exodus from Egypt, and specifically the eating of the matzah and the obligation to refrain from eating chametz. And it says at the end of that, and it shall be as a sign on your hand and a zikaron, instead of totofos, says as a memory between your eyes. Then in the second paragraph, talking about the fact that God has killed all the firstborn and saved us, and therefore we should dedicate our firstborn to God. It says it shall be as a sign on your hand, and again it uses the word totofot, between your eyes. Now, typically, very traditionally, most people would say that the reason we put on tefillin is to remind us of the love of God, of the commandments of God, the Pesach offering, and the exodus from Egypt. And we bind it on our hand, but really on our arm. It's not on our hand, and our arm right opposite our heart. And we wear it between our eyes, really on our brain. And the idea is that we dedicate ourselves completely, both emotionally represented by the heart and intellectually represented by the brain, and we devote ourselves completely to God in that way. And that's a very common understanding of the symbolism of the mitzvah of tefillin, but I would suggest that there's always a difference and a possible sort of evolution of how tefillin or any mitzvahs were understood in ancient times and how we understand it in more modern times. And when I say modern, I don't mean modern the 20th century. I mean the last maybe 1,000 years or so. And it takes on more of a symbolic explanation, and maybe it's removed a little bit from the way Jews understood it in ancient times, or a couple of thousand years ago. And when I say the way Jews understood it, I'm not sure if the way what the Torah really wants of us, but rather I'm suggesting that there's a difference in how we understand what the Torah wants of us, both in ancient times and now. Let me be a little bit more specific. The idea of the heart and the brain is really not something which seems to fit into the way people understood the functions of the heart and the brain, because they understood the heart actually not being the seat of emotion, but actually being the seat of the soul or the intellect. And the brain, they didn't really understand the function until much later. So therefore, to say that that's what the tefillin are representing is not so simple. Rather, if you read this week's portion, it says in the beginning, you shall remember that the day which God took us out of Egypt. And it also says, and therefore, when later on, when it says it should be a os hayadcha sign on your hand and a remembrance between your eyes, it's using the same word. That's the only time the one between your eyes is called a remembrance, because it said remember, now it's saying remember between your eyes. It doesn't say on your head. We understand that halachically as being on the top of the head, but it's really between the eyes. In other words, we want you to see and remember that which God did for us in Egypt. And the fact that it's a sign on our hand, right before that it said God took us out b'chozek yad, with a strong hand. He took us out of Egypt. So we're trying to remember the strong hand that God took us out, and we're trying to remember that which that between our eyes, that which we saw with our own eyes and our own experience in Egypt, and then of course through tradition from generation to generation. So it's maybe simpler, and it's just saying, remember that which happened, and remember the fact that God took us out with a strong hand, and he did what he did. And therefore, the word zikaron, the memory between your eyes, is used in the paragraph which uses the word memory, and all the other places called totafot. So what are totafot? So totafot are translated as phylacteries, which if you speak English, you have no idea what they are, except that they are tefillin, but it really that's a Greek word. And that Greek word is really understood as sort of more of an amulet, as something which may be a protective force. And this is understood as a loan word from Egypt or from Africa, Rashi suggests, and modern scholars suggest. And it's very possible that it means just a frontlet, meaning an ornament, but it also might mean something that the Egyptians wore. They always wore something on their head, like a headdress. They used to have like a cobra on their forehead, or other types of ornaments, which might have acted as an amulet. And one scholar I saw said that, well, really it's saying that instead of wearing an amulet as a protective force like the Egyptians wore, which is somehow connected to their god, but rather it doesn't say it is that protective force. It should be lit totafos, to or as totafos. And as they wore their gods on their head and these amulets, but we don't have the protective force of just this sort of the divine superstitious belief, but rather it's to remind us instead of those forces that God enacted for us to save us, and we remember God. So it's not a protective force by magic, but rather it's the fact that we remember it. But again, as I said in earlier times, many Jews might have understood that it actually acted as a protective force, just like they understood the mezuzah as a protective force on the house. Maimonides and others would argue that that's a superstitious belief, which we are not supposed to believe, and that although today commonly you'll hear people say that a mezuzah acts as a protective force for your house, Maimonides says that's not acceptable. But rather the mezuzah is there. It also, we have the sections of the Shema, and when we walk into our house and through the door, we're supposed to remember, V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, you shall love God with all your heart and all your soul. You should dedicate yourself to the God, the one God, and to the Kabbalah soul mitzvahs, the acceptance of the yoke of the commandments. And that's what we devote our life to. And that's what we want to remember. So the idea here is that it might have been understood as an amulet, but I would rather personally, and according to Maimonides for sure, would understand that which might have been used as amulets and protective forces in magic in earlier times, we have to transform that, and we have to take those symbols which were used for superstitious beliefs and just use it as a symbol, saying, no, we no longer believe in these superstitions, but rather we take these ideas and these principles and these love of God and our dedication to the Torah, and we constantly remember it. It's in our hand. You could say it's opposite our heart, but it's in our hand. It's in the way we act and what we do and the forces that we use in our daily life. And between our eyes, you could say it's the brain, but it's also between our eyes that we should remember and see constantly in front of us this dedication to these principles and to the Torah. And perhaps that's another way of understanding what the meaning of tefillin is, what the symbolism is, and what it's supposed to really translate how it's supposed to translate for us into trying to transform our daily life, not to just be a mundane life, but constantly be aware of the fact that God is in our life. Good Shabbos.